There comes a moment in the life of every civilization when the danger no longer announces itself. It does not arrive with banners or invasions. It does not declare its intentions. It does not even feel hostile. It feels familiar. Daily life continues. Institutions function. Markets open. Conversations repeat themselves. And beneath this reassuring surface, something essential begins to loosen its grip. Not power, not wealth, but form. History does not destroy civilizations abruptly. It erodes their sense of proportion. The Stoic philosophers understood this with unsettling clarity. They believed that collapse begins not when strength is lost, but when restraint is forgotten. When success dulls vigilance, when comfort replaces discipline, when continuity is mistaken for permanence. We live in such a moment, not at the threshold of catastrophe, but well within a pattern that has unfolded with remarkable consistency across centuries and cultures. A pattern so reliable that it ought to disturb anyone who has studied history with seriousness rather than sentiment. Empires do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because they expand beyond their capacity for self-command. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural one. And it is why the most dangerous phrase in any age is, "This time is different." Before examining that pattern, we must first understand what imperial decline truly looks like. Not in legend, but in lived reality. Decline is not the absence of power. It is the misuse of it. At first, nothing seems amiss. Currency circulates. Armies exist. Laws are enforced. The state speaks confidently. The population assumes stability is the natural order of things. Yet beneath the surface, resources begin to misalign. Commitments multiply. Promises exceed capacity. Debt replaces production. Appearances begin to matter more than substance. The Stoics called this akrasia, weakness of will. The moment when a person or a society knows the limits it ought to respect and chooses to ignore them. This moment rarely feels dramatic. It feels rational. Every excess is justified. Every warning postponed. Every correction deferred. Until correction is no longer voluntary. History offers us several complete case studies of this process. Not partial examples, not disputed interpretations, but full civilizational arcs, from dominance to diminishment. The first of these was Spain. In the 16th century, Spain stood at the center of the world's economic gravity. Its fleets carried unprecedented quantities of silver and gold from the Americas into Europe. Its currency became the medium through which global trade flowed. To contemporaries, Spanish power appeared unassailable. And yet, the seeds of decline were already planted. The influx of wealth removed the necessity of discipline. Why cultivate domestic production when imports were easily purchased? Why innovate when extraction sufficed? Why restrain ambition when resources appeared limitless? Military commitments expanded across continents. Wars multiplied. Prestige demanded projection. Soon, expenditure exceeded revenue. The solution chosen was not contraction, but concealment. Currency was debased. Coins retained their face value while losing their substance. Inflation followed. Trust weakened. Prices adjusted. Confidence eroded quietly. Seneca warned that wealth unearned by effort breeds a kind of moral lethargy. Not corruption in the crude sense, but softness. A loss of inner tension, a forgetting of limits. Debt filled the gap left by restraint. Borrowing became habitual. Defaults became cyclical. Reform was promised and postponed repeatedly. But the most decisive damage occurred elsewhere. Spain ceased to produce. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. The social elite withdrew from labor. Status became associated with consumption rather than contribution. Wealth passed through the nation without settling into it. When the silver diminished, nothing remained to replace it. Social cohesion fractured. Crime increased. Talent emigrated. The empire persisted geographically, but it had lost its center of gravity. Within a century, Spain had transitioned from global hegemon to historical memory. It never recovered. 3 centuries later, the same structure reappeared, though clothed in different institutions and ideals. Another empire rose to global prominence, commanding trade routes, finance, and naval dominance. Its currency underpinned international exchange. Its reach spanned continents. Once again, success bred overextension. Global commitments accumulated. Military obligations multiplied. Prestige demanded maintenance. The cost of administration grew heavier with each decade. Then came war. The first great war of the 20th century altered everything. Victory preserved appearance, but destroyed balance. The financial burden transformed the creditor into a debtor. Attempts were made to restore the pre-war order. Currency was defended beyond its natural value. Domestic industry suffered. Structural weakness was masked by nostalgia. Another war followed. Victory arrived again. But the empire could no longer sustain itself. Territories were relinquished. Influence contracted. The currency declined from its former position. What remained was dignity, tradition, and memory, but not dominance. History had not been cruel. It had been consistent. The most recent example occurred within living memory. A vast ideological empire, armed with nuclear weapons and animated by certainty, devoted extraordinary proportions of its resources to military parity. It matched its rival in form, but not in economic substance. Central planning suffocated innovation. Productivity stagnated. Agriculture failed. Currency functioned by compulsion rather than trust. When real resources diminished, the system collapsed with astonishing speed. No invasion, no final battle, simply withdrawal. These 3 cases, separated by centuries, ideologies, and cultures, followed the same sequence. Expansion beyond restraint, monetary distortion, debt dependency, productive decline, social fragmentation. This is not coincidence. It is structure. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. No civilization has ever escaped this pattern by believing itself exceptional. The Stoics would not have been surprised by this. They believed that nature operates according to laws that do not negotiate with pride. Marcus Aurelius wrote that what happens to the whole is no different in principle from what happens to the individual. Overindulgence weakens. Excess creates dependency. Avoidance of discomfort breeds fragility. Civilizations, like people, are strongest when they remember their limits. The danger arises not when hardship arrives, but when success removes the memory of hardship entirely. This is why decline so often begins at the height of prosperity. Because prosperity convinces societies that caution is unnecessary. The early stages of decay are therefore invisible to most. Life appears stable, institutions still function, language still reassures. Yet something subtle changes. Debt becomes normal. Consumption replaces creation. Virtue is redefined as comfort. Restraint is mistaken for regression. The Stoics taught that freedom is not the ability to satisfy every desire, but the ability to govern them. When that governance weakens, decline accelerates, quietly, politely, almost invisibly. This reflection is not offered as alarm, nor as condemnation. It is offered as orientation, because those who recognize patterns early gain something invaluable. Time. Time to adjust expectations. Time to strengthen foundations. Time to cultivate qualities that endure beyond systems. History does not repeat mechanically, but it does rhyme with remarkable precision. And those who listen carefully can hear it long before the final verse is written. There is a particular danger that accompanies long success. It is not arrogance in the crude sense, nor vulgar pride. It is something far more refined, and therefore far more destructive. It is the belief that continuity is natural. When institutions endure for generations, they begin to feel inevitable. When systems survive repeated crises, they are assumed to be self-correcting. When prosperity becomes familiar, it is mistaken for permanence. The Stoics warned explicitly against this mental error. They argued that the human mind is deeply uncomfortable with impermanence. It seeks patterns that reassure. It prefers narratives that promise continuity. And it resists any suggestion that what exists might not endure. Civilizations share this psychological weakness. They do not fail because they are ignorant of history. They fail because they believe history has concluded its lessons. At the structural level, decline follows a recognizable progression. The first stage is extension without proportion. Power expands geographically, administratively, militarily. Obligations multiply faster than capacity. What once required discipline now requires constant exertion merely to maintain appearances. This stage rarely feels like weakness. It feels like responsibility. Commitments are framed as moral duties. Retrenchment is portrayed as failure. Reduction is equated with retreat, and so contraction becomes unthinkable. Even when necessity demands it, the Stoics would have recognized this as a failure of judgment. Epictetus taught that wisdom lies not in possessing many things, but in knowing which things one can afford to lose. A civilization that cannot relinquish commitments it can no longer sustain is already in danger. The second stage is monetary distortion. When obligations exceed resources, there are only three options: reduce commitments, increase productivity, or manipulate the medium of exchange. History shows that the third option is chosen most often. Currency is stretched. Promises are made against future output. Debt replaces discipline. The distinction between value and price blurs. This does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives incrementally. Each intervention is justified as temporary. Each deviation is framed as necessary. The Stoics warned that repeated exceptions eventually dissolve the rule itself. Money ceases to represent labor honestly. Trust becomes abstract. Value is deferred rather than earned. At this point, the system is no longer anchored in reality, but in confidence. And confidence, unlike substance, can vanish quickly. The third stage is dependency on debt. Debt in itself is not a vice. Used wisely, it can accelerate growth, but when debt becomes structural, when it is required merely to preserve the present, it transforms from tool to trap. Interest begins to consume resources that once funded development. Policy becomes reactive rather than strategic. Decisions are made to avoid immediate discomfort rather than to secure long-term stability. Seneca described this state precisely: the condition of living beyond one's means, not out of extravagance, but out of fear of reduction. At the civilizational level, this fear manifests as paralysis. No faction wishes to be associated with restraint. No institution wishes to bear responsibility for contraction. And so the system drifts, financed, maintained, extended, but no longer renewed. The fourth stage is the erosion of productive capacity. This is perhaps the most consequential and the least discussed. A society that consumes more than it produces must either borrow indefinitely or rely on external systems to sustain its standard of living. Both options increase vulnerability. Production requires patience, skill, and continuity. Consumption requires only access. Over time, cultural prestige shifts from creation to acquisition. Status becomes associated with visibility rather than utility. Practical competence yields to symbolic influence. The Stoics regarded this as a profound inversion of values. They believed that dignity arose from contribution, from aligning one's effort with the needs of the whole. When this alignment dissolves, social cohesion weakens. The final stage before overt decline is fragmentation. Trust in institutions diminishes. Public discourse coarsens. Language becomes adversarial rather than deliberative. Identity replaces reason as the primary organizing principle. This fragmentation is often misinterpreted as purely political or cultural. In reality, it is structural. When systems no longer deliver proportional outcomes, belief in fairness erodes. When effort no longer correlates with reward, cynicism spreads. When narratives replace accountability, meaning disintegrates. Marcus Aurelius warned that a society divided against itself becomes incapable of correcting its own errors. Correction requires consensus about reality. Fragmentation destroys that consensus. At this point, decline accelerates not because of external pressure, but because internal coordination becomes impossible. Yet, it is crucial to understand something. This process is not deterministic. History reveals patterns, not sentences. The Stoics rejected fatalism. They believed that while events may be constrained, response remains free. But response requires clarity. And clarity is rare in times of comfort. Most people do not resist reform because they are malicious. They resist it because it threatens familiarity. And familiarity feels like safety. This is why decline is so often normalized. Each year feels only marginally worse than the last. Adjustments are made. Expectations are lowered. What would once have been unacceptable becomes tolerable. This gradualism is deceptive. It trains people to accept less while believing they are maintaining the same standard. The Stoics referred to this as moral adaptation, the quiet lowering of internal benchmarks. The danger is not hardship. The danger is habituation to decline. Yet within this danger lies opportunity, because those who perceive the pattern early possess an advantage that others do not. They are not surprised by constraint. They are not destabilized by volatility. They are not psychologically dependent on uninterrupted expansion. They adapt deliberately rather than reactively. The Stoics prepared for instability not by predicting catastrophe, but by cultivating resilience. They practiced voluntary discomfort to reduce fear of involuntary loss. They simplified desires to preserve autonomy. They invested in character because character survives systemic change. This perspective is profoundly relevant. Periods of transition do not reward entitlement. They reward competence. They do not favor those who demand restoration. They favor those who accept transformation. History does not ask whether change is fair. It asks whether individuals and societies are prepared. And preparation begins not with policy, but with disposition. The capacity to endure uncertainty, the willingness to relinquish excess, the courage to act without guarantees. These are Stoic virtues, not as abstractions, but as survival mechanisms. What follows decline is never uniform collapse. It is differentiation. Those who cling to outdated assumptions suffer most. Those who adapt early preserve continuity within change. This has always been the case, and it is why understanding the structure of decline is not pessimism. It is prudence. When the external structures of a civilization begin to loosen, something subtle occurs. Attention turns inward, not by design, but by necessity. In periods of expansion, individuals define themselves through institutions, through careers, status, affiliations, symbols of belonging. The system provides meaning by default. In periods of contraction, this scaffolding weakens. And when it does, a more difficult question emerges, one that cannot be deferred indefinitely. Who are you when the structure no longer carries you? The Stoics regarded this question as unavoidable. They believed that every human being would eventually be stripped of externals, whether by fortune, time, or circumstance. The only uncertainty was whether this stripping would occur gradually, allowing for preparation, or suddenly, producing collapse. Civilizations experience the same reckoning. When systems cease to guarantee continuity, individuals must rediscover internal orientation, duty, measure, self-command. These are not fashionable concepts. They never are during periods of abundance. They acquire relevance only when abundance no longer absolves neglect. The ancient Stoics distinguished sharply between status and worth. Status, they argued, is conferred by others and withdrawn without consent. Worth is cultivated internally and cannot be confiscated. A society that confuses the two builds itself upon sand. As decline advances, the illusion of universal security dissolves. Pathways that once felt reliable become contingent. The promise that effort will be rewarded loses clarity. Predictability fades. This is not injustice in the moral sense. It is reality reasserting itself. The discomfort people feel during such transitions is not merely economic or political. It is existential. It arises from the sudden absence of a narrative that once organized life. The Stoics referred to this moment as the encounter with fate, not as doom, but as exposure. When the external world ceases to flatter us, it reveals what we have actually become. Those who have cultivated inner form endure. Those who relied entirely on external validation struggle. This is why periods of decline produce such sharp psychological divergence. Some individuals become bitter, resentful, nostalgic. They fixate on restoration. They demand that reality revert to a familiar configuration. Others become lucid. They recognize that history does not reverse, that systems do not apologize, that progress, when it returns, takes a different shape. These individuals do not mourn excessively. They adapt. The Stoics admired this capacity deeply. They regarded adaptability as a higher form of strength than rigidity. Epictetus taught that one should not demand events conform to one's desires, but rather align one's desires with events as they occur. This was not passivity. It was strategic acceptance. Applied at the civilizational level, this insight is transformative. A society that insists on preserving form at the expense of function accelerates its own decline. A society that relinquishes form to preserve function may yet endure. This distinction explains why some cultures regenerate after crisis, while others fragment irreversibly. The key variable is not wealth, it is character. Character, in Stoic terms, is the capacity to act rationally under pressure, to maintain proportion when emotion surges, to resist indulgence when discipline is required. When character erodes at scale, institutions cannot compensate. Laws multiply, but compliance diminishes. Rules expand, but enforcement weakens. Authority persists, but legitimacy fades. The result is not tyranny, but drift. And drift is the most dangerous state of all, because drift feels tolerable until it suddenly is not. This is why the Stoics emphasized voluntary hardship, not suffering for its own sake, but deliberate exposure to discomfort as a means of preserving autonomy. To practice simplicity while abundance still exists. To cultivate silence amid noise. To strengthen the body and mind before necessity demands it. These practices were not ascetic theater. They were preparation. Preparation for loss. Preparation for change. Preparation for unpredictability. A civilization that neglects such preparation becomes brittle. It cannot absorb shocks. It cannot recalibrate. It cannot reform without crisis. This brittleness manifests socially as polarization, culturally as superficiality, psychologically as anxiety. People sense instability, but cannot articulate its source. They search for scapegoats rather than causes. They confuse symptoms with origins. The Stoics warned against this confusion. They taught that emotional disturbance arises not from events, but from mistaken judgments about events. A society that misjudges its own condition responds irrationally. It seeks reassurance rather than reform. It amplifies distraction rather than clarity. It rewards those who soothe rather than those who tell the truth. Yet decline does not erase the possibility of excellence. It clarifies it. In every historical contraction, there emerges an informal aristocracy, not of birth or wealth, but of disposition, an aristocracy of restraint, of competence, of seriousness. These individuals do not announce themselves. They are often invisible, but they carry continuity forward when systems fail. They preserve standards. They transmit knowledge. They embody stability amid volatility. The Stoics belonged to this lineage. They did not seek dominance. They sought durability. Their ambition was not to control history, but to remain intact within it. This distinction is critical. Those who aim to dominate are shattered when dominance becomes impossible. Those who aim to endure adapt when conditions shift. This is why Stoicism resurfaces whenever civilizations begin to lose confidence in their permanence. It offers not hope, but orientation, not optimism, but steadiness. It reminds individuals that meaning does not originate in expansion, but in coherence. That dignity arises from proportion. That freedom arises from self-mastery. That continuity arises from transmission, not preservation of form. As institutions weaken, responsibility returns to the individual. This is not a burden. It is an invitation to cultivate what cannot be devalued, outsourced, or confiscated. Judgment, skill, temperance, courage. These qualities are not fashionable. They are timeless, and in periods of historical transition, they become decisive. Because when systems falter, the future belongs not to those who protest, decline most loudly, but to those who quietly remain capable. There is a moment, subtle yet unmistakable, when a civilization realizes that it is no longer moving forward unconsciously. Momentum fades, assumptions weaken. The future ceases to feel automatic. This moment is often misinterpreted as decline alone. In truth, it is something more precise. It is exposure. Exposure of habits. Exposure of character. Exposure of what has been neglected during times of ease. The Stoics understood that history does not punish, it reveals. When fortune withdraws its favor, it does not act with malice. It merely removes concealment. What remains is what was always there: discipline or its absence, coherence or confusion, proportion or excess. Civilizations, like individuals, are judged not by their peak, but by their response when equilibrium is disturbed. This is the stage now approaching, not an ending, but a narrowing. The narrowing of tolerance for inefficiency. The narrowing of forgiveness for excess. The narrowing of patience for illusion. Such periods are uncomfortable because they strip away ambiguity. They force distinctions. They compel choice. The Stoics believed that fate presents circumstances, but leaves dignity to those who meet them well. What does it mean to meet such a moment well? It does not mean nostalgia. It does not mean despair. It does not mean frantic reinvention. It means alignment. Alignment between words and actions. Between resources and commitments. Between ambition and capacity. When alignment is restored, stability returns, not in its former shape, but in a more sustainable one. History shows this repeatedly. Civilizations that survive transition do not preserve everything. They preserve what matters. They relinquish ornament. They shed excess. They retain principles. This is the essence of continuity, not permanence of form, but transmission of substance. The Stoics placed enormous importance on this idea. They believed that one's duty was not to freeze the present, but to carry forward what was essential. In times of abundance, this duty is easily forgotten. In times of constraint, it becomes unavoidable. The question then is not whether transformation will occur. It will. The question is whether it will be navigated consciously or endured blindly. Blind endurance breeds resentment. Conscious navigation breeds renewal. This distinction separates decline from degeneration. Degeneration occurs when a society loses standards, but retains appetite. Renewal occurs when it retains standards and moderates appetite. Standards, in Stoic terms, are not regulations imposed externally. They are expectations imposed internally. The expectation of competence. The expectation of restraint. The expectation of seriousness. A society that abandons these expectations does not collapse immediately. It drifts, and drift, prolonged, becomes fall. Yet history also teaches something else, something rarely emphasized. Even in periods of broad contraction, islands of excellence persist. Craft survives. Learning survives. Judgment survives. Not everywhere, but somewhere. And these places become the seeds of what follows. The Stoics never believed that the whole must be saved for the part to remain meaningful. They believed that integrity at the individual level was sufficient to justify existence, regardless of the scale of surrounding disorder. This belief is not retreat. It is preservation of lineage. Civilizations do not die because their people suffer hardship. They die because their people forget what they are for. Comfort obscures purpose. Constraint clarifies it. If the coming years feel more demanding, less indulgent, more exacting, this will not be a failure of history. It will be history restoring balance. Those who respond with seriousness will find that seriousness rewarded, not with spectacle, not with applause, but with durability. Durability of mind, durability of competence, durability of contribution. The future does not belong to those who shout most loudly about decline. It belongs to those who quietly remain capable of thinking without hysteria, capable of acting without excess, capable of enduring without bitterness. These qualities do not trend, they endure. If you have remained with this reflection until its end, it suggests a particular disposition, a resistance to simplification, a preference for depth over reassurance, an understanding that history is neither enemy nor savior, but a force to be met with intelligence. Such dispositions matter more than opinions. They shape how periods of transition are lived, whether with panic or with composure. If this reflection has sharpened rather than soothed, that is intentional. Clarity is not comfort. It is orientation, and orientation in uncertain times is invaluable. If you wish to continue this line of thought, not as passive consumption, but as shared inquiry, you are welcome to remain here. Not as a follower, but as a participant. A considered acknowledgement helps ensure that such reflections reach others who value substance over spectacle. A quiet gesture, a thoughtful remark, a deliberate sharing, not widely, but wisely, with someone capable of engaging rather than reacting. And if you choose to leave a comment, let it add something, not agreement, not praise, but reflection. Because it is through reflection, patiently exchanged, that standards survive periods of noise. History moves forward regardless. The question is not whether change will come. The question is whether, when it does, there will still be those capable of carrying form, judgment, and dignity through the narrowing passage. That has always been how civilizations truly endure.